Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Abraham Lincoln, and the focus is Reconstruction and Assassination. The year is 1864. Lincoln's re-election has been confirmed. He's got another 4 years ahead to plan as President of the United States, and he's very much thinking on what's going to happen after the war. The military situation finally looking like that Grant and Sherman and his generals could put in the final blow, the war would be over, and then it's time for reconciliation, bringing the South back into the Union. Lincoln talking about very generous terms, trying to do this very quickly with very low bar. He's also got some headwinds that he's running into in the North, not only in the South, but in the North. The radical wing of the Republican Party, increasingly strong in Congress, pretty much against Lincoln's plans. They wanted more punishment for the rebels. They wanted to impose very strict rules on how to treat blacks, the freedmen that would be coming out of the Civil War now as free. So this was going to be a tense period, and Lincoln was going to need all of his political skills going forward. But first, of course, he needed that victory. He started spending more time at City Point, which was the headquarters of General Grant. Grant and his men surrounding Lee in Richmond and Petersburg, and Lincoln spending time with him talking about reconciliation, Reconstruction, and in Grant's words, the terms were pretty straightforward. First, that the Union as a whole must be forever preserved, and second, that slavery must be abolished. If they, the Confederates, were willing to concede these 2 points, then he was ready to enter into negotiations and was almost willing to hand them a blank sheet of paper with his signature attached for them to fill in the terms upon which they were willing to live with us in the Union and be one people. Very low bar, ratify the 13th Amendment, end slavery, get rid of their ordinances of secession, be willing to come back within the Union, and Lincoln was going to be pretty open to generous terms. Well, the Confederates knew that their military situation was getting pretty desperate, and so they actually asked for an opportunity to speak to Lincoln about terms, about what it would like to bring this war to an end. Lincoln was reluctant here. This is early February of 1865. He didn't think that the Confederates were really ready yet. They thought one more big military victory was going to be needed, but he did agree to meet with some representatives from the Confederacy, including a former colleague, Alexander Stephens, who had been with Lincoln in the House of Representatives, and the U.S. House of Representatives had recently been serving and still serving as the Confederate Vice President. Stephens and a couple of others met with Lincoln for about 4 hours. No agreement. The Confederates indeed were not ready to just come back to the Union, were not ready to give up slavery, so the fighting would continue. The following month, Abraham Lincoln takes his oath of office in Washington, D.C. for his second term, a very different Washington, D.C. than any inaugural before. This one, practically a war zone, because of course the war is continuing. Lincoln gave one of the most memorable inaugural addresses in his second inaugural, deeply religious overtones and a peroration that was frankly the most memorable perhaps of all inaugural addresses. According to the president, fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Well, perhaps nothing could have been more welcoming for a return of his countrymen. Thought one more fight ought to do it. In late March of 1865, Lincoln headed back to City Point, more meetings with his military leaders, with General Grant and General William Sherman. Also David Porter, an admiral, was there, meeting on the River Queen, where once again talking about what life was going to be like after the war was over. And General Sherman came away with these thoughts from President Lincoln, that he contemplated no revenge, no harsh measures, but quite the contrary, and that their suffering and hardships during the war would make them more submissive to law, get back on the same page, and things should be good. Now, Sherman had only met Lincoln a couple of times before this session, and he came away like most, extremely impressed. According to Sherman's impression, I felt that his earnest desire was to end the war speedily without more bloodshed or devastation, and to restore all the men of both sections to their homes. Of all the men I ever met, he seemed to possess more of the elements of greatness combined with goodness than any other. Greatness combined with goodness. This is the way a lot of people describe Abraham Lincoln. Well, Ulysses Grant opened up the final offensive on April the 2nd. General Lee and the Confederates quickly abandoned Richmond. They went on a sprint to try to escape the grasp of Ulysses Grant. In the meantime, the government in Richmond of the Confederacy also left that city. They left it in flames. They set the torch to Richmond. When Lincoln heard that finally Richmond was in the hands of the Union Army, he was thrilled. He told Admiral David Porter, "Thank God that I have lived to see this. It seems to me I have been dreaming a horrid dream for 4 years, and now the nightmare is gone. I want to see Richmond." Well, Porter was happy to comply with that request. They got on his vessel, and they eventually transferred to a single barge, where they were ready to finally come ashore near Richmond, and a rather remarkable scene occurred. As Lincoln got off and he got onto dry land, he was in the backyard area of an area where there were about 12 blacks, former slaves that now were in the process of being freed. They recognized the President of the United States. They called him the Messiah, and they bowed down to President Abraham Lincoln, who immediately said, "No, no, don't kneel to me. This is not right. You must kneel to God only and thank Him for the liberty you will hereafter enjoy. I am but God's humble instrument. But you may rest assured that as long as I live, no one shall put a shackle on your limbs, and you shall have all the rights which God has given to every other free citizen of this republic." The group gathered around as Lincoln was getting set to go. They sang a couple of hymns, and Lincoln left this crowd with some thoughts. He said, "My poor friends, you are free, free as air. You can cast off the name of slave and trample upon it. It will come to you no more. Liberty is your birthright. God gave it to you as He gave it to others, and it is a sin that you have been deprived of it for so many years. But you must try to deserve this priceless boon. Let the world see you merit it and are able to maintain it by your good works." With that, Lincoln bade adieu. He headed on into Richmond. Again, the city is in flames. He is surrounded by the local community, getting a lot of blank stares. This is hardly a welcome for the President of the United States, although he did get to see his troops in blue, the Union soldiers there in Richmond, both white soldiers and black soldiers that he was able to review. Lincoln made his way into the home of Jefferson Davis, his former counterpart, or actually I guess current counterpart as the war is still going, the President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. Lincoln made it to his home, made it to his office, made it to his chair where he took a seat, perhaps a moment to reflect on this thing finally coming to an end. It was just a couple of days later that Lincoln heard from General Grant that General Lee of the Confederates had agreed to meet to discuss terms. It was on April 9th, Palm Sunday, that they met at Wilmer, McLean's house in Appomattox Court House. Terms were agreed to. The Army of Northern Virginia was no more. Within another month, the remaining armies within the Confederacy would also give in as well. The Civil War was coming to an end, and Abraham Lincoln was able to go back to Washington, D.C. and greet a cheering crowd, welcoming their commander-in-chief in this time of ultimate victory. This victory came with significant cost. 620,000 Americans died during the course of the Civil War. That was about 2% of the U.S. population. 2% of the population today would be about 6 million people. This was a big impact, and more than twice that many were actually wounded or missing on top of the dead. The Confederates were disheartened. The economies were in shambles. This was a horrific set of circumstances that eventually ended with the Union coming back together, the slaves being freed, but it certainly came at very high cost. April 14th, 1865. That's Abraham Lincoln's last day on earth. He spent it mostly with his family. In fact, his wife, Mary Lincoln, and his oldest son, Robert, and now his youngest son, Tad, that was all that's left of the nuclear family of Abraham Lincoln, and he started the day with oldest son, Robert. They had breakfast together, and Lincoln said, "Well, my son, you have returned safely from the front. The war is now closed, and we will soon live in peace with the brave men who have been fighting against us. I trust that the era of good feeling has returned, and that henceforth we shall live in harmony together," the optimism of Abraham Lincoln. He welcomed General Grant to Washington, D.C. Part of the victory celebration brought him to a cabinet meeting. In fact, invited Grant and his wife to join Lincoln and his wife, Mary, to the theater that night. They were going to Ford's Theater to see the play, Our American Cousin. The Grants declined. They were off to New Jersey to see their own children. They went on their way. Lincoln actually spent the afternoon with Mary on a carriage ride and also in a reflective mood when he said to her that, "Mary, we've had a hard time of it since we came to Washington. But the war's over, and with God's blessing, we may hope for 4 years of peace and happiness, and then we'll go back to Illinois and pass the rest of our lives in quiet." Of course, none of that would ever come to pass. Lincoln did one final action as President of the United States. It was to issue a pardon for a soldier who had been sentenced to death for desertion. According to Lincoln, the commander-in-chief, "Well, I think the boy can do us more good above the ground than underground." And so he gave him the pardon. Ward Lamon was Abraham Lincoln's unofficial bodyguard throughout his entire presidency, and he often warned Lincoln, "You're not taking these threats on your life seriously." He would bring it up time and again, but Lincoln, frankly, was dismissive. He understood the threats against his life. He didn't think there was much you could do about it, so he's not going to worry about it, and he went on his way. Lamon was not with Lincoln on April the 14th. He was on a different assignment, actually back in Richmond, Virginia. And so there was a guard that went to the theater. John Parker was with them. He found a seat by himself after escorting Abraham and Mary Lincoln, along with their companions, Major Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris, his wife, into their box. And Parker went to get a seat. They actually got there late. There was a big rousing ovation for the president as he sat down, and then all was fine until the third act of the play. A shot rang out. A man jumped out of Lincoln's booth and onto the stage. He had yelled something and ran off. Everyone looked up, and the president was slumped over. Clearly, Lincoln had been shot. Panic ensued. Soldiers rushed in. They cleared the place out. Lincoln barely breathing. They carried him across the street to William Peterson's house. A vigil took place in a back bedroom with the cabinet mostly there. Lincoln's a couple of family members with his wife Mary and son Robert were there, but basically waiting for the inevitable to occur. They had also heard that Secretary William Seward, he had been attacked in his bed. Perhaps he had been killed as well. So there was a lot of confusion going on, but all in that room were focused on the president. His final breaths that eventually came, 7:22 in the morning. The gunshot from John Wilkes Booth had done what he had intended and had ended the life of Abraham Lincoln. He would be no more, as Secretary Edwin Stanton said ever so simply, "Now he belongs to the ages." Well, Lincoln lay in state in the East Room of the White House. The funeral was held on the 19th of April. The new president, Andrew Johnson, presiding. Robert and Tad, his children, were there. Mary was not. She was too distraught. She was in deep mourning. She was unable to attend that, nor get on the train to go back with the body back to Springfield. That was next up for Lincoln. He would go on that train, 21-day journey back to Springfield, with thousands gathering along the way to pay their last respects. The body arrived in Springfield, Illinois, May the 3rd, spent a night in the Illinois State House before being moved to the receiving vault at the Oak Ridge Cemetery. And then several years later, a grand tomb with a 117-foot obelisk was finally constructed, and that's where Lincoln's remains would remain, eventually joined by Mary and 3 of his children, by Willie, by Eddie, and by Tad, would all be buried there with the Lincolns. The assassin, John Wilkes Booth, he was killed in the manhunt several days after the shooting. There were 8 conspirators who were arrested. 4 of them were hanged that July. Many consider Abraham Lincoln to be the greatest president in American history, and to that you look at the 2 major outcomes that he achieved. He preserved the Union at its point of greatest peril, and he freed the slaves. For a lot of folks, that's all they need to know. The outcomes justified every step, the cost of the war, the tact that he took. He achieved what no one else could. He preserved that Union. He freed the slaves, making him the greatest president in American history. But we do have to look at his methods, because his methods are important both for the current time as well as possibly for posterity. Because Abraham Lincoln did take some liberties. He assumed for himself, frankly, more power than the Constitution had authorized and more power that any other president would ever take. He believed that if he had to violate the Constitution in order to save it, that was okay, and he did throughout the war. He took some of the most monarchical steps of any president in American history. He ignored orders of the Supreme Court. He had usurped the authority of the legislature. He had tossed aside constitutional protections for the citizenry. He even advocated in the Erastus Corning letter that it might be okay to arrest people before they committed crimes as a preventative measure. These are the kinds of things that all-powerful despots get to do. But Lincoln did them, in this case again, that combination of greatness and goodness for the greater good. The ultimate ends justify the means. What may be anathema to strict constructionists was the only way in Lincoln's mind to actually save the Union. John Wilkes Booth ended the life of Abraham Lincoln at still a young age, 56 years old. It was a significant loss, obviously, to him, his family, and the country, because as much as important as Lincoln had been through the war to get through that victory, perhaps his most important contributions were really to come, to be that balance of both compassion to bring the South back in quickly, but also to recognize the goals of the war to begin with. This was going to be a difficult, messy environment, and frankly, without Lincoln, it would not go very well. But Lincoln would not be around because, as Stanton said, he was now one for the ages thanks to the assassination by the bullet of John Wilkes Booth. The career and life of Abraham Lincoln had come to this abrupt end. That is Abraham Lincoln, Reconstruction and Assassination, from the life of Abraham Lincoln. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.